What's up, Green Bay Packers fans? Welcome back, and as always, thank you for joining me. My name's Paul Brettel. Today, I'm here to go over my final 53-man roster prediction for the Green Bay Packers. But first, hit like on the video, hit subscribe on the YouTube channel. I greatly appreciate it. You can follow me on Twitter at Paul_Brettel, and you can find all my work, including this article, over at Packers Wire. So let's dive in. My final 53-man roster prediction based on preseason performances, taking into account what I saw from the sidelines during training camp, and the Packers, along with the rest of the NFL, have to have these final rosters completed by 3 o'clock Central Time on Tuesday the 29th. So very shortly from now, we're going to start hearing about those initial roster cuts for the Packers coming in as they work their way down from 90 players down to 53. So let's start at quarterback. Keeping two, Sean Clifford and Jordan Love as the starter. Pretty straightforward at this position. Matt LaFleur even said earlier in the week prior to the Seattle game that Sean Clifford had her in the backup role, and I don't think that's a surprise to anyone at this time. At running back, I've gone back and forth on this all preseason. As you know, if you followed along, Patrick Taylor is absolutely running back 3. There's zero question in my mind about that. His ability on special teams, consistency as a pass catcher. He caught 7 of 9 passes this preseason. His willingness, capabilities as a blocker checks all the boxes in terms of what the Packers are looking for in that third running back role. The question for me was, do they keep 2 running backs or 3? And for the time being, I ended up keeping 2 running backs, Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon, to give me just a little additional roster flexibility at this time. Now, with that, they're of course going to have to elevate Patrick Taylor for week 1 in Chicago. 1, he can contribute on special teams, as we just mentioned, and 2, just to make sure that you have enough running backs to get through the game in case an injury were to happen. And the rules with that are Taylor or any practice squad player can be elevated up to 3 times. After that third time, they have to either be released or signed to the 53-man roster. So the Packers either have to be okay with, letting Taylor go and him potentially signing elsewhere, and if no team claims him at that time, the Packers can sign him back to the practice squad. But of course, there's some risk in that. Or at that time, they'll have to make room on the roster for him and sign him to the 53, which would result in making a cut elsewhere. So definitely something that factors into this equation in terms of how the Packers handle this position as the season progresses. But for right now, getting Taylor to the practice squad shouldn't be an issue, and it gives the Packers some added flexibility on their 53-man here initially. At the receiver position, I went heavy, ended up keeping 7 players. Malik Heath, as I talked about in my last video recap in the Seattle game, he absolutely earned a roster spot. He was on the field the first snap of the game with the starters, has been consistent as a receiver, shown a willingness to do the dirty work that we know the Packers like at that position as a blocker. So he's on this team. Grant DuBose, a very small sample size for him, but I thought with his body of work, he was able to showcase, again, some playmaking in the passing game. Very capable and willing as a blocker as well. I know we go back to that a lot talking about the receiver position for the Packers, but it is really important. And then Samori Toure. I know with Malik Heath's emergence, there's been some chatter about whether he'll make the roster or not. He's not the flashiest player. We all know that. But for the most part, throughout training camp in the preseason, he's been pretty steady. And at a young position group, and not that I expect him to have a big role by any means, but I think there's value in that steadiness. I also go back to last season at a position that was a lot more experienced than what it is now. They kept Toure as the 7th receiver last season. So now looking at this year's group, again, he is from a playing time standpoint, the 3rd most experienced player on this roster right now at this position. So I think he's going to be someone that they keep on the team, and they go heavy and keep 7 wide receivers. Tight end, I ended up keeping just 3. I guess Josiah DeGuara is technically a fullback, so I went with just 2 tight ends. I think it's very possible, Brian Gutekunst even said so, that they're going to keep their eyes on the waiver wire, once the roster cuts around the NFL happen in terms of making an addition at this position group. But Matt LaFleur also said that if they have to, they're comfortable going into the season with these 3 as their tight ends. He referenced the depth of the receiver position and also the possibility of using an offensive lineman as a blocker. We saw a few seasons ago when Mercedes Lewis was out for a game that they had a 6 offensive lineman on the field at times to help with blocking. Perhaps that's a way to get Yosh Nijman or Rasheed Walker some snaps. So for those reasons, the ability to put an offensive lineman out there, the depth of the receiver room, again, filled with capable blockers. For the time being anyways, I'm going to go with 3 tight ends. Offensive line, went with 9. David Bakhtiari, Elton Jenkins, Josh Myers, John Runyon, Zach Tom, Rasheed Walker, Yosh Nijman. We know those guys are going to be on the team. As I've talked about previously, it really came down to Caleb Jones, Sean Rhyan, and Royce Newman battling for 2 spots. And if the Packers decide to go heavy and keep 10 offensive linemen, all 3 of those players could be on the team. Caleb Jones, the Packers just really like him. Brings rare size to the offensive tackle position. He's someone that just as recently as Thursday, the team's final training camp practice, he was seeing some snaps with the starters at left tackle. And looking ahead to 2024, where there's some uncertainty around this position, Nijman could be gone, Bakhtiari could be gone, gives them another developmental option to perhaps earn some playing time next season as well. So I have Caleb Jones as my 8th offensive lineman, and then I went with Sean Rhyan over Royce Newman. Ryan has just been far more consistent this season or this summer compared to Royce Newman. Also from a developmental standpoint, there's more upside. Ryan's a second-year player, former third-round pick, whereas Newman is entering year 4, I believe, and if anything, he's been regressing. I mean, his rookie season on a 13-win team, he played over 1,000 snaps, and now there's definitely times where he looks like someone you don't even want to see on the football field right now. So I went with Sean Rhyan over Royce Newman because of his just consistency this summer. Switching to the defensive side of the ball, I went with 6 interior defensive linemen: Kenny Clark, TJ Slaton, Devontae Wyatt, Kobe Wood, and Carl Brooks, and then Jonathan Ford. We know the first 5 are going to be on the team. The question was whether or not the Packers will keep 6 interior defensive linemen. Jonathan Ford's play this summer, I just couldn't afford to keep him off. He's a run stuffer who's been able to generate consistent push. He's also flashed a little bit as a pass rusher, although that's not going to be what he's asked to do. Matt LaFleur went out of his own way to talk about how Ford has upped his game for year 1 to year 2. And he provides a backup option to TJ Slaton at that nose tackle position. If last year the Packers were willing to keep Ford as a 6th interior defensive lineman, knowing that he wasn't going to contribute at all, he was inactive for all 17 games last season, have to think they'd be willing to keep him this year when there's actually a path for him to contribute in obvious running situations and get him on the field in that capacity. And as we all know, the run game is one area where this defense has to prove themselves. They have a ton of pass rush options. Brian Gutekunst has said so, but success all starts with stopping the run. And not that Ford's role is going to be big by any means, but he's someone who can help in that capacity. At edge rusher, I went heavy again. I kept 6. Ended up keeping Brenton Cox on the roster. As I've talked about previously, Justin Hollins was not a roster lock. He's a veteran on a 1-year deal at a pretty deep position group. And if the Packers move on from him, there's no, significant salary cap impact from it. That's really a recipe for a team moving on from a veteran player, but he's seen a lot of reps with the ones. He's just been so steady, too, as a pass rusher, as a run defender, not only this summer, but since he joined the team last season after the Packers claimed him once he was released by the Rams. Also saw some starting snaps on special teams as well. So I couldn't get rid of Justin Hollins. And Brenton Cox, just too much potential. And we saw that really over the entire preseason. According to Pro Football Focus, Brenton Cox led this Packers team in pressures generated during the 3 preseason games. And I've made this comparison before, but Brenton Cox's path in 2023 looks like it could be pretty similar to Caleb Jones in 2022, an undrafted rookie at that time. The Packers initially put him on the practice squad, but after coming back from the NFI list, was on the 53-man roster the entire season, and as a developmental player, which is what I assume Cox's role is going to be largely this season. With Jones on the roster, the Packers had 11 offensive linemen, which is going very heavy at that position. Similarly to keeping 6 edge rushers is going heavy at that position, but they've set a precedent showing that they're willing to roster those high potential players, rather than put them on the practice squad where they could potentially be signed away. So I think they take a similar path with Cox this season. At linebacker, I kept 4: Devondre Campbell, Quay Walker, Isaiah McDuffie, and Eric Wilson. I really went back and forth on this with Tariq Carpenter and whether to keep him as the 5th linebacker or not. Eric Wilson, similarly to Justin Hollins, could be one of those surprise veteran cuts. Again, a veteran here on a 1-year deal at a position group where his main role is only going to be on special teams. But I think with Tyler Davis's injury, Eric Wilson's role as that veteran presence, someone who can play and make an impact on a variety of special teams units, I think his value increased, again, because of losing Davis this season. So I think he's someone that's going to be on this team. But as far as Carpenter goes, ultimately, and maybe I'm overthinking this, I know his main role is going to be on special teams. However, he was the 6th linebacker from a defensive standpoint. He was behind the 4 players just mentioned. And then Jimmy Phillips, the undrafted rookie from SMU, was playing ahead of him too. Like, this has been a really, really steep learning curve for Tariq Carpenter to make that adjustment. And we all know that that's going to be a part of it, the learning curve and switching positions. But, he was the 6th linebacker from a defensive standpoint. And when he was on the field, even going against, second, third string offenses, for the most part, he was struggling as well. So just that part really stuck with me. And so ultimately, I ended up releasing him. From a special team standpoint, he also didn't see as many snaps with the starters as I imagined that he would, especially coming off of what his role was a season ago on that unit. So that was one of the tougher decisions that I had to make in putting this roster together. But ultimately, what maybe lost on special teams from Carpenter, I tried to make up for at the safety position, which I'll get to here shortly. At cornerback, kept 5: Jair Alexander, Rasul Douglas, Keyshawn Nixon, Carrington Valentine, and Innis Gaines. I have Eric Stokes starting on the PUP list. Matt LaFleur was asked about that on Sunday. He did not specify one way or the other if Stokes was going to be activated off the PUP list, but at least up to this point, there's really been no signs that that's going to be the case, so I have him starting the season there. And if he does begin the season there, he has to miss at least the first 4 weeks before he can potentially return. We know the first 4 players that I mentioned are going to be roster locks. For me, this came down to either Innis Gaines or Corey Ballantyne. Ultimately, I went with Innis Gaines because I just think he can do more. He is a slot cornerback, and as I've talked about on here, the Packers do not have, of the players mentioned, all those guys are boundary guys. Jair Alexander obviously can play inside, but he's someone that you just want moving around. You don't necessarily want to say you're only going to play here. So Innis Gaines can provide a second option in the slot, which again, this roster could benefit from. He's also listed as a safety and has experience playing there as well. So if in a pinch, he can provide some snaps there. And then he was a core special teams player last season, as well as the summer when healthy. So I just think that, as they say in the NFL, the more you can do, I just think he can do a little bit more than Corey Ballantyne, who brings special teams value as well, is a boundary cornerback, and that's where he spent most of his summer playing. Next up, the safety position. I've gone back and forth on this group all summer, keeping 6, keeping 5, even keeping 4 at one point. But ultimately, I kept 6, in part because I did move on from Tariq Carpenter, because there's a ton of special teams value within this unit. Anthony Johnson, Jonathan Owens, Tavarius Moore, Dallin Levitt can all make an impact in that phase of the game. Rudy Ford and Darnell Savage look like they're going to be the week 1 starters, but all of these players minus Levitt, got some snaps with the starting defense this season as well. So at a position with a lot of unknowns still, a lot of question marks, there's at least options available to, mix and match, try different combinations at the starting position if things just aren't going well. So I ended up keeping 6 safeties. The last time the Packers did this on their initial 53-man roster was in 2016, so it's been a little bit. However, Ken Ingalls, who tracks the Packers salary cap and roster moves, he had an interesting tweet that last season, the Packers averaged 5.71 safeties each week that were either active, inactive, or elevated. So what that number tells us is there were several games last season where the Packers did have, in some capacity, 6 safeties on the roster, whether they were active, inactive, or elevated from the practice squad to game day. So even though keeping 6 on the initial 53 is not common for them, having 6 on the roster in some capacity on game days as recently as last season was something that they did. Lastly, the specialists, Anders Carlson, Matt Orchek at long snapper, and I went with Pat O'Donnell as the punter. I really went back and forth on this, and ultimately, even when I was leaning towards Daniel Whelan, what the clincher for O'Donnell was for me was during that final preseason game, O'Donnell was holding on every one of Anders Carlson kicks. So what that tells me, trying to read the tea leaves, and again, maybe overthinking it, maybe looking too much into it, but in that game environment, they were trying to give those two as many in-game snaps together as they could because it's their plan to go into the season with those two. Obviously, Carlson's the kicker, O'Donnell's the punter and the holder as their two in that capacity. If there truly was a competition or if they were looking at Whelan, I have to think that he would have been out there getting some snaps as a holder in a real game environment, whereas he was only handling the punting responsibility. So for me, that was the clincher in this decision. As I've talked about before, Whelan packs a lot of power. Rich Bisaccia has said that he's gotten more consistent as a holder, but there's a lot of risk going into a season with a rookie kicker and a rookie holder. So there you have it. There's my 53-man roster. I'll be back with a practice squad prediction video as well. Hit like, hit subscribe. I greatly appreciate it. You can follow me on Twitter at Paul_Brettel. You can find all my work over at Packers Wire. So until next time, friends, take care, stay safe, and as always, go